Hi everybody, welcome to the next lecture in the Shaping Policy with Evidence short course. My name is Jessica Meeker. I'm a Knowledge Officer at the Institute of Development Studies, and today we're going to talk about communicating research, thinking about different methods of communication, and talk a little bit about framing and why framing matters. So what are we going to cover? Today we're going to think a lot more about our target audience. So understanding our audience and thinking about different communications methods and how to choose different methods that are appropriate for different audiences. We're going to work on messaging and thinking about how to craft key messages, thinking about what would resonate with different audiences. And finally, we're going to cover something called framing and think about how we might use that effectively in our communications and how it can help us or possibly hinder us and how to navigate around that. The outputs from today will be working in the shared mural space, which you all should have received the link for. And there's going to be 3 exercises, so quite a lot of practical work to put into practice what we're going to talk about in theory. So, thinking about audience, we've unpacked our problem, identified what our overarching goal is, and you've spent a little bit of time identifying who your key stakeholders are and mapping them out on your alignment and interest matrix. You've also talked a little bit about thinking about different forms of evidence and what evidence you might use, but how do we communicate it in a way that really engages with our audience? How do we get them to listen to what we have to say? How do we get them to act differently? It's really common when thinking about communications to jump straight in and start thinking about which products or which activities we might want to do without really thinking about who these products are designed for and what it is that we specifically want these people to do differently, how we want them to change their actions or change their behaviors. And so what we'd always suggest is backing up a little bit and first, way before you think about messaging, products, activities, really go back and think about your audience. And so you can see in the diagram here, we've got 2 circles. So one of them is what we want to say. What is it that we're trying to communicate? And that's often what we focus on the most. What are we trying to change? What are we trying to tell them? Actually, what we really need to stop and think about is what the audience is interested in. So circle number 2, what is it that resonates with them? What are their values? And what we're trying to find here is that little shaded area in the middle that we like to call the relevance sweet spot. So where what we want to say might align with what our audience is interested in. And that's what we're going to think about how to find today. So to effectively influence somebody's behavior and potentially their decision making, we need to understand a lot more about them. And one way we can go about doing this is to think about creating profiles, or sometimes we call them personas. Profiles can be created for a specific person. If there's a single person that you've identified as influential, sometimes it can be one particular individual within a particular place in government or in a particular organization. But more often than not, it tends to be groups of people or types or typologies of people. And we would commonly segment our audiences into groups with similar behavior characteristics. Then we would gather as much information as we can to build a picture up of how they engage with evidence or how they might be engaging around the issue that you're working on. So we're going to work through a series of questions. It's also mirrored in your workbook. So if you want to find this exercise in your workbook and work through it, that can be helpful. And what we're going to do is talk through it, and then I'm going to ask you to pause this recording and go and work through that exercise for 5 minutes yourselves. And so something we would commonly do is to identify one of the key stakeholders that you've already looked at in previous weeks. Pick one out, pick the one that's particularly influential, or maybe pick one out that isn't closely aligned with the issue that you're working on. And then we're going to work through a series of questions just to try and unpick a little bit more about what it is that might motivate them to do something differently. So we're going to think a little bit about who they are, thinking about what their goals or what their values might be, and then thinking about how they might consume information. What sources do they go to? How do they like to receive information? And this can be quite different for different audiences. For example, when we were interviewing policymakers in India, a significant proportion of them said that they often turned to the broadsheet newspapers for thinking about, information about the decisions that they were working on a particular topic. So it can be quite different depending on who you're thinking about targeting. Thinking about who they listen to, who do they trust? Is there a particular organization that's quite eminent in that field that is credible and has built up credibility? Do they listen to particular advisors? Do they listen to particular news channels, for example? And then think a little bit about why should they care about what you care about? So thinking about the problem that you're working on. Why is it that this particular stakeholder or group of stakeholders should care about that issue? What is it that would resonate with them? And then finally, think about what it is that you want them to do or how you want them to think differently. What behavior are you trying to change in them? Okay, pause the recording here for a moment and then turn to your workbooks and spend 5 minutes or so just filling this out for a particular issue that you work on in your work, and then we'll come back and have a think about it. Okay, I'm hoping that you've had 5 minutes or so to think through some of these questions for some of your stakeholder groups. How did you find it? Was it quite easy to answer some of the questions, or was it quite challenging? It can be often quite difficult to gather some of this information, and we'll talk a little bit more in our breakout groups on Tuesday when we meet about ways in which you can go about accessing and sourcing some of this information for your profiles. Reflecting on the answers that you've generated for them, how might the answers to the questions change the way in which you communicate to different audiences? And if you were to fill this out for 4 or 5 different audience groups, what might it make you think about doing differently? Okay, we'll come back to that one. So let's ask one of our audience groups. We conducted some research into how policymakers like to receive complex scientific information on a particular topic. In this case, it was around nutrition. And so we conducted some key interviews with key informants or policy decision makers in multiple different countries. And this is just a quick digest of some of the results, just as an idea of some of the things to consider when it comes to communicating to different audiences. So you probably won't be surprised to hear that they like to keep it short. No more than 4 pages was often what came through, and often, ideally, with recommendations very clearly laid out up front, so it's quick to find. Avoiding jargon. I think we can all fall into the trap of using sector or topic specific jargon or terminology, often without even realizing we're doing so. So really thinking about keeping it very simple messaging for your audience that is not full of jargon, and avoiding complex statistics. Thinking about timing. So you might have the perfect message, but actually thinking about when to communicate it can be just as effective. So understanding a little bit about the policy cycle and the external context. Is there a particular time when a policy on your issue is being reviewed? Policymakers tend to like the information being given to them at the right time when they need it. Framing and messaging. We're going to talk about framing more in a moment. Thinking about what it is that's going to resonate with your particular audience. Does it fit in with their current beliefs and values? And finally, credibility was something that came through quite strongly. So either the credibility of who's writing the piece, is it an organization that has credibility in the eyes of the person reading it? Or is it written in a way, in a tone that lends credibility to it? Is it an authoritative piece? So those are some of the things that came out from the piece that we did to bear in mind when you're thinking about crafting your messaging. We've thought more about our audience. We're going to think a little bit now about what different kinds of products or activities or outputs, we often call them, we have to options we have to use, and what kinds of activities might suit different audiences or different contexts. This exercise is in the mural space. So if you want to pause the recording or after this lecture, go to the mural and think about doing this activity and seeing which different outputs you might choose. We've got 4 different audiences to think about and lots of options for different products. If there's something that isn't listed, this isn't a definitive list, feel free to add a sticky with what you would use. I know some people work with things like community theatre and other ways of crafting messaging. So this isn't your only option. These are just some examples that you can choose. And for our audiences, we've got a senior official at a donor agency where you're looking for the go-ahead for more funding to a programme based on its existing impact. We have a finance minister, former economics professor. You're looking to get a decision on spending more money on health centres in a particular country. A high-profile activist, looking to engage them in evidence-informed campaigning on closing a civic space. And finally, a global film star. How can you engage them into helping you in improving turnout in the national election? And so think about the audience, think about the outcome that you're hoping to achieve. Think back to your last exercise on understanding the target audience. What outputs would you use to engage them? And choose 1 or 2 different methods to match each audience to its intended outcome. So moving on to framing and what we mean by framing. So we've already built up a picture of who our target audience is, and we've now identified some of the different products or activities that we might use to engage with them. But is this enough? Thinking about people, what underpins the way that we act, the way that we behave? It's values and beliefs that often make this process more complex. And so we need to understand more about how we use language to present issues and how this taps into people's belief systems and their emotional behaviours. So there's some quotes here by a professor called George Lakoff, who's a professor of cognitive science, and he often applies his work to the political science arena and has written extensively on the art of framing. And here's just a selection of quotes from one of his books that I thought really kind of underpinned what we're going to talk about. And so Lakoff writes that frames are mental structures that help shape the way we see the world. As a result, they shape the goals we seek, the plans we make, and the way that we act. To change our frames is to change all of this. And Lakoff writes, reframing is social change. So what do we mean by framing? Here's an example. This was an apple left on the table in the common space at IDS. And it had a note on either side. I've doctored it slightly just for this exercise, but just as an example, have a look. One's written free, take the apple, and the other not poisoned. Which note would make you most likely to take the apple? What do you immediately think of when you read the second note? Sure, I'm wondering, why would they even say that? Possibly poisoned. And another example, if I was to say, don't think of an elephant, what are you all thinking of? So this is just an example of how particular words can build up a mental image in your mind. And it's a very useful tool when writing messages or products. There can be words or phrases that elicit an emotional response or support from your audience, or there may be phrases to avoid as they have the opposite effect. The mainstream media does this really effectively, for example, often framing refugees as migrants. Can you think of any other examples of framing? Jot them down on the mural if you can. So here's an example of framing going quite wrong. This is a quote from President Nixon when he was questioned about his involvement in the now infamous Watergate scandal. And his response was, people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. aiming to reassure the people of his integrity, but instead adding to the perception that he was dishonest. So framing gone wrong. And so we've talked quite a lot in our breakout groups about how if only it was enough to have the right evidence and finding the right evidence to underpin what we're trying to communicate. And I think we've all agreed that actually it's not enough just to have the facts. And so this is the cover of George Lakoff's book and some other quotes from it saying, if only you could get all the facts out there in the public eye, then every rational person will reach the right conclusion. It's a vain hope. Human brains just don't work that way. When the facts don't fit the frames are kept and the facts are ignored. And what Lakoff means is that even if you're given evidence to show that something is a particular way, if it doesn't fit your current beliefs and your mindset, you'll find an internal rationale to ignore the facts and to keep your beliefs. So how do we try is how to reframe an issue. And reframing is the flip side, the opposite of framing. And it's a way of altering the presentation of an issue to counter some opposing views. Sometimes the original frame in which the issue is described or explained might not be the best one for you or others concerned with the problem. And in such cases, it may make sense to reframe the issue for your audience. It could also improve your chances of solving the problem. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by reframing. So here we've got an example from the anti-tobacco lobby or the anti-smoking. And for years, the anti-smoking campaign promoted health messaging around the risks of smoking on one's health. And yet rates of smoking remained pretty high. Then in the 1980s, the evidence about passive smoking and the effects that passive smoking can have on other people's health came to light. And this campaign reframed the issue of smoking, not just as a risk to one's own health, but also of the health of those around you, and in particular, children. The clever element to this messaging was children, a really emotive issue. Many people will do more to protect their children than they will do to protect themselves, and this campaign was a huge success. Just an example of how reframing it from thinking about your individual health to the health of those around you and your children can have more impact. Another example from the world of nutrition, for many years, stunting or chronic undernutrition was seen as a health issue and the responsibility of the ministries of health to address, often with minimal resources. Countries were quite slow to prioritize the issue and investment to improving nutrition remained low. Then a number of studies were conducted on the long-term effects of stunting on income generation and GDP. And this reframing of stunting as an economic issue speaks to a much wider audience, including those, more crucially, holding the purse strings, and made the case for investment in nutrition. So, how do we go about using framing? We've got another exercise, which is in your workbooks, and you'll find an abstract from a paper on mental health under COVID-19. If you read the short case study on mental health, and then for each of the 3 different audiences listed, think about crafting 3 different messages that you think would resonate with those audiences. Those audiences are quite different. So the first one is a marketing executive from Facebook. The second, someone from a mental health NGO. And the third, the permanent secretary in the Department of Education. So think about what it would be that you'd want each of those 3 different audiences to do differently based on this excerpt on mental health, and how you would craft messages that would resonate with those audiences. And then secondly, for each of those audiences, think about one phrase or a keyword that you think would actually be quite unhelpful and might have the unintended negative effect of turning them off and thinking about how your framing could be got wrong. Capture your responses in the mural, and we'll discuss it when we come together on Tuesday and think about whether we found it quite simple to do, whether there was anything in particular that we found quite challenging, and have a discussion around how we might use framing when it comes to our own work. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier in the research that came out of the interviews with policymakers about timing. And so the last thing I want to think about is key moments and the wider context. It can be great to get your messaging right, to understand your audience, to have the right product or activity ready to go. But actually, is it the right time? How do we know when the time is right? And so thinking about how you position your communications alongside others working in the same space can be really helpful. Who else is talking about these issues? What other debates or events are taking place? Are there, global days around the issue? And then secondly, is there a policy window? Is there an opportunity to time your message with the revision of a policy or the creation of a particular policy? How do you make sure the timing is right? And that's something that's really key to think about when you're developing your strategies. Okay, so we've thought through understanding our audience. We've thought through different methods of communication. We've looked into how to craft key messages and how to think about framing or reframing an issue to use it effectively. And these are all tools that we're going to think about putting into practice when it comes to building our strategies, building on all of the other tools that we've worked on over the last couple of weeks. So I look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday in our live session. There'll be plenty of time to discuss some of these issues in more depth and to think about putting them into practice to use our communication most effectively to achieve impact. Thanks.